Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan, also known as the Medieval Genie, and today I wouldn't want to call it a response too much because I don't want to make this sound like some sort of sparring match, pardon the pun about historical European martial arts, but I wouldn't want to show this as some sort of flame war type of thing against the guy who I'm adding to, I guess is a better term for it. The guy was called SnapJelly, and he did a video which was called HEMA is full of pussies, which is this talk about things like sparring experiences and anecdotes from his training. And I thought, with my perspectives, I thought I'd talk about it as well. It's an interesting topic for discussion. I haven't discussed it in as much detail yet. Now the reason I'm responding to a video that's a few years old already is because someone had shared it recently on a place on Facebook called the HEMA Council. And I thought, well, if there's still active discussion going on about it, it might be worth adding a little something to it and maybe, furthering the discussions a bit more. So without further ado, in terms of my experience with sparring, of course, we come from different backgrounds, me and him, so I'm going to have a different attitude than he is. But I thought firstly, it should be worth mentioning that people's attitudes towards sparring and towards things like tournaments change depending on not just different people, but also different circumstances. So one example is if we look at the comparison between two sort of tournament-y types of events I've gone to. So I've been to a few different events. I won't make a whole shopping list, but two that strike me as more stark contrast would be the Wessex League tournament that I went to, and the Swords and Cider event, which is held, or used to be before the pandemic, held annually by my local club, the Iron Door Collective. Now, the stark contrast there, even in the name, so Wessex League is very much, it's there to be a tournament. It's a competition. You think of it as a non-famous, non-televised equivalent of Wimbledon for tennis. You've got people who are either turning up to participate in a tournament, in a competitive environment, or people who are turning up to watch that, just like your typical tournaments in other, dare I say, sports. I know some people don't like to call HEMA a sport, but we'll say that event was a sport at least. And compare and contrast that with Swords and Cider, where people are turning up, it's quite casual, I like to turn up early because I feel cool when I'm starting a fire and everything's all going, and have a good spot for my tent. People have drinks in the evening. Obviously don't drink before sparring, it's all after all of those things have happened, but sometimes people have sharps, we do a bit of test cutting, we might do a little bit of training, to learn some new styles, like one time we'd learned some African sabre, and one of my favourite tournaments was something called the Random Weapons Tourney. Now, unlike Wessex League has, it's a more serious situation, the stakes are higher, you end up getting changes in what's called the HEMA rankings, so it's got it is, like it says, it's a ranking of people, the fighters with their styles, and who's maybe better and worse, who's number one, who's this and all of that, and the graphs showing you how better and worse you are, and it is getting almost, I wouldn't want to poo-poo on the event and say that it's bad. It's not bad. It's not something that I'd say I didn't enjoy. I very much enjoyed it, but it is a more serious approach in the Wessex League because people are turning up for a more proper competition. Whereas when I go to Sword and Cider, everyone's having a laugh. It's just a bit of fun. Nobody really cares who won or lost. It's just another story on around a beer and do you remember the time this happened? Oh, that was brilliant, sort of thing. It's a stark contrast. So I've noticed, having been around the same people going to those different events, even with those same people, the attitude changes very distinctly. And I'd have anecdotes about times like when I was in the Random Weapons Tourney, I was up against this guy and he had a two-handed sword, and my ticket ended up being an empty plastic bottle. Now obviously this is not going to be a situation where you're expecting an even matchup, even though we were fairly beginners all those years ago, me and the French guy I was up against. Nobody really was you know, some people weren't even bothering to look, because, you know, you're just having a laugh. Some people are chatting, some people are heckling, and, you know, like I was in the middle, you know, I was batting the guy's sword away and trying to defend myself. I didn't know what I was doing, and it was hilarious. Nobody was taking it too seriously. And then one of the guys in the audience go on, Johnny, bottle him. So I did a parry and then wham, and I whacked his leg, and I think he was off balance and overextending himself, but he nearly fell over. In fact, I have actually got a video showing that stuff happening. It was hilarious. But by comparison, if you're looking at something like the Wessex League, of course people are going to have more stress and tension because it does matter more. I mean, in terms of the events, you know, to a person like myself, they both, as events in HEMA, they matter just as much. One is a tournament where you're being more serious, one is a good fun time, but it's all part of that experience I have in historical European martial arts. But in terms of the attitude and the seriousness, of course Wessex League has more importance in that sense. So with that, I found that when I was sparring up against people, I was paying more attention, I was more stressed, even if not to any extremes luckily, and I was more cautious and wary about what I'm doing and trying to make sure that I look like a competent fighter. It mattered more in that sense. So hence, it did change people's attitudes towards the fighting. But also outside of different events, you can have different people who have different attitudes towards sparring, and it depends on, of course, what sorts of styles and things we're using, but also people's backgrounds and experiences. So you'll have people who, for example, are closer to extremes like the Holmgang, as they're called in Germany. Excuse me, people who are used to doing crazy things like having sharp swords, very little to no protective gear, and just going all out on each other. Versus people who perhaps have more of a, you know, certain experiences. Maybe I shouldn't say any particular specifics because I might sound like I'm, you know, declaring them to be wusses or something, but people who have softer backgrounds might not be used to doing all of that full contact sparring, or might want to just kind of, you know, test their skills in a more free and non-drill, a sort of an open, any target is valid, try all kinds of stuff type of situation, but they'll be a bit more cautious and a bit more scared about it. And that is also going to be quite naturally the case, that it's going to lead, I find it goes more towards the extremes with beginners more. People tend to settle in and get a good idea of what's what, and, you know, trying to make sure that they're doing things right, well, without too much effort really, when they're more experienced. But when they're beginners, they tend to fall in two camps. People who were like me at the beginning, who are basically terrified of swords, and they want to become epic warriors one day, but truthfully, there's a steel or a plastic thing or whatever, sword flying in their direction, you know, shut your eyes tight and go, you know, and then you've got the people who are there thinking they're tough, hard nuts, and want to just swing and put everything into every blow and get very tired within about a minute flat because they put their entire body into every swing. And you think like they're trying to demolish a building rather than spar with another person. So yeah, those extremes do tend to come from a lack of experience, but it tends to settle in afterwards. But if you're ever worried, you know, this is more practical advice perhaps, if you're ever worried about what sort of attitude to take in that sense, my golden rule is fast but not angry. So by that I mean, if you are, you know, if you're doing your sparring, you know, you shouldn't hold back in a sense that you're kind of slowing yourself down and making yourself a worse fighter just to try and not spook the other person too much, except in some circumstances, like maybe if they're complete beginners and you want to kind of ease them into it a bit more. But, you know, in general, you want to make sure, of course, that you're fighting competently. You don't want to be doing this kind of slow motion, babyish, gentle stuff too much. But at the same time, if you're getting stressed and angry and you're getting to that point where every time you strike, you're almost having that intention to cause real injury. I don't just mean the if I had a sharp sword and we were dueling, this would kill you type of thing. I mean, you know, you're actually trying to break bones behind the protective gear, and you've got, because of anger, because of spite, because you hate the person, whatever reason, you actually want to cause serious wounds to them in real life, even though this is just sparring, that's when you need to stop. Or, you know, if that's happening to you, you'd say, you know, call it off. One example I had from when I've been sparring was, and I don't blame either of us, we were both getting each other pent up, although I'd say maybe it was more my fault perhaps, but I was sparring against this person. We didn't have protective gear on, we were just using foam sabres, so you know, doing a bit of sparring, and it started off all right. You know, I'm doing my usual parry or post game. He's trying to have at it. You know, he's new. He just wants to give it a shot, swing. He was doing all right. He's a fairly athletic guy, and you know, so he's got that physical speed to go for. And he was trying it, and I was getting kind of frustrated because he was hitting me more often than I felt like should be happening for someone who's got a good tight defence like myself. And it was probably to some degree because he was, you know, he had that attitude more kind of I'd call a suicidal attacking, where he was committing so much to getting that hit landed that it was to the detriment of his defence. So he was getting hit more often, I was getting hit more often. There are a lot of what in HEMA we call doubles, which is where both people strike each other basically at the same time, or, you know, one slightly after the other, but it's basically, you know, if it was with a real sharp sword, we'd both die or be seriously injured type of thing. But it was kind of escalating, and it was getting worse and worse and worse, to the point where I was getting quite frustrated, and I was just trying to, you know, wallop him, he was trying to wallop me, and I saw this was kind of getting bad. So I just said, you know what, let's call it off and let's calm down. And you know what? We sat down, we chatted, had a bit of a laugh, and we're still friends, you know. This wasn't the start of some bitter rivalry. We just got a bit carried away, and because we saw the signs and, you know, I said, let's just call it off, we were able to calm down, take a breather, and it didn't get into anything serious and, you know, problematic. So it's good to notice those signs, and like I said with the golden rule, fast but not angry, if you're not holding back with your speed and trying to make sure you're doing the best you can, make sure you don't get too carried away. So that's fine. But apart from that, in terms of protective gear, of course people will sometimes need you to adjust your sparring. So they might say, for example, I don't have this piece of protective gear, could you try not to hit me there? Of course, sometimes I might warn them and say, look, you can't get away with that forever, you should try to make sure you are decently protected, because you might get hit by accident, or, you know, the person might forget or something like that. You shouldn't gamble on such things, but, you know, if that situation is happening, just make accommodations. But also things like injuries as well. Sometimes a person might have work the next day and they might have, let's say, something twisted in their ankle, or, you know, something happened with their arm, or, you know, whatever, and they still feel like they're able to do sparring but with a bit less intensity. And I say, if you're not willing to accommodate that, maybe just find someone else to spar with. If you're willing to accommodate that, fantastic. You know, that's the best way to do it. And with regards to, in general, with long-term, how much protective gear people should have, I've always said that you should try to look at what realistically is going to happen and warn people, you know, about things. Like, for example, I guess I'm maybe trying too hard to make a sort of a combatant name, or, you know, like a nickname, but I often in these videos call myself the hand carver to describe basically my penchant for taking cheap shots, truth be told. But it means that when I'm sparring with people, I often target around the hands and the forearms as and when they expose themselves. Again, it's part of my defensive game. Rather than try to go in for something like a head and risk being injured in the first place, I might go and, you know, dodge an attack and then strike someone's arms while they miss my torso, or something like that. But it means that in this one particular case, I was sparring with steel weapons. Now, bearing in mind, I would recommend with steel weapons, you know, the proper real deal type of thing, I'd always recommend that you have pretty much as much protection as possible. You're padded out like the Michelin tyres guy, you know, you've got your head to toe protection. And with this particular guy I was fighting, he had One glove which was a red dragon glove, which is it's a bit similar to a lacrosse glove. It's okay for some medium grade sparring, but it tends not to protect quite well enough against steel weapons, I find. And on his left hand, he had a leather glove. It was like a driving glove. Definitely unsuitable for anything above, I'd say, foam sparring. You know, even with a plastic sword, you can end up getting a wicked bruise on there, or a lump forming. So, as you can imagine, I was quite wary. But he said, you know, he wanted to spar with me, steel. I said, look, I noticed that, you know, you've got general good gear, but you've got very little protection on your hands. Is it okay if we still spar? And he said, you know, it should be alright. And I explained to him further that, bearing in mind that because of my fighting style, I am going to target areas like the hands and forearms a lot. You know, it's part of my style in how I'm going to counter his style. And, you know, he said it was okay. We kept sparring. Unsurprisingly, he got injured. It wasn't a serious injury, granted. You know, he just kind of, it was bruising a bit, and he said, you know, it's getting to that point. Instead of stopping the sparring because you're getting too tired, it was stopping sparring because of sort of a pain threshold, I guess. But it's that situation where, in that case, you could, you know, get angry about it and say, well, actually, you're going to risk serious injury, but it depends on your interpretation. But for me personally, I find that if the other person is willing to accept the risk, you're clear with them that, you know, I target the hands and forearms a lot. Are you sure you still want to continue sparring? I don't think those gloves will be protective enough against a big two-handed steel sword. And they say, yeah, I'll be fine. That's fine. And if an injury happens, obviously they shouldn't complain about it afterwards. They should realise that it's the protective gear. And you know what? He didn't, you know, he took it like a champ. He said, you know, maybe I should get better gloves, but you know, that was a good, fun bit of sparring. And that sort of thing. So it shows that actually, if you are being clear with these sorts of people up front, rather than making it a thing and making a scene out of the whole ordeal, because of that kind of open communication between the people who are sparring, and having that relaxed attitude where you're not, you know, you're not holding back and, well, you're not hiding that tension about it all and kind of getting stressed, and people tend to, through your body language, pick up on that, and you're getting frustrated at them because they're being silly about it, and they're getting frustrated at you because they think you're being, you know, overly serious. You know, that kind of thing can end up getting out of hand. But in a situation like my example, by being upfront and just, you know, not belittling them or treating them like it's some sort of teacher and child type of thing, you're just being honest with them, I find that kind of open communication really helps smooth things over. So it means even if there is that risk that perhaps I'm sparring with someone and they might get injured, by having that clear and open communication, it really does help make sure that the sparring is going to go well. And in the long term, I would recommend trying to be open and honest with people, and, you know, not talk about them behind their back, or, you know, call them a pussy, or all this kind of angry stuff and get all of the drama. Just, you know, you say the things that need to be said, don't make a scene. Simple stuff. That's my attitude. Now, of course, this doesn't make the world perfect. There are always going to be instances. So I, for example, once experienced, there was a person who came from a reenactment background, and I mean, you know, people have different levels of intensity. I'm not saying this is all people from reenactment, but this one specific guy, he came in, wanted to try things out. You know, he was doing a few of the drills with us, and with the club that I go to, it's usually the first half, you know, for an hour, they do drills, so just learning techniques and doing that kind of restricted technique training. And then for the second half, the last hour, people just do what they want. It's usually a good bit of sparring, you know, ask questions to the teachers, oh, how is this done? You know, all that kind of stuff. So I'm usually ending up sparring. So I ended up sparring against this guy, because I love sparring against new people. Not necessarily new in the sense of being inexperienced, I just like having a diverse range of people and not rigorously learning how to deal with one person and their style only to become useless against anyone else. I like to, you know, have a diverse range of skills. So I go up against this guy, and unfortunately it didn't go so well. I think maybe I'd went a bit too intense. He did end up, I don't know if the dent was already in the mask that he borrowed, but there was a clear, quite distinct dent in there. Maybe I was going a bit too intense and had actually, gone quite powerfully. I know I wasn't angry, but I still might have been overzealous, caused that dent, and you know what? Maybe that's, a sign of being a bit too over-enthusiastic against someone who's being there for the very first time. Or you could interpret it that actually this is just normal sparring and that he was being a bit too a bit too scared of what real sword fighting's like. That's up to your interpretation. But of course, like I said, it's not always going to go perfectly and you are going to have incidents like that. But still, I find that with the right attitude and with a good bit of experience, just get used to people and, like I said earlier, being honest and open with them, you can get along quite well. So that's my thoughts. Like I said, I didn't want to really cause drama with SnapJelly or try to add counterpoints and say, you're wrong, I'm right, and all this kind of YouTube drama stuff. I just wanted to add a few thoughts on top of that from my own experiences. So I hope that was a good bit of fun, and I shall see you in the next video. Ta-ra for now.
In his defence, he's done really well considering. He's done really well considering.